The sky over occupied France was a blade of crystal blue that April morning in 1943. At 27,000 feet of altitude, the air was thin, cutting, and the silence had weight, the kind of silence that precedes all the changes man cannot foresee. Hauptmann Ernst Keller adjusted his flight goggles and cast his gaze through the fogged glass of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 cockpit. Below, the earth was an abstract tapestry of green and grey fields, dotted with villages that barely moved under the German yoke. The Daimler-Benz engine purred in constant, familiar rhythm, a sound he knew, like his own breathing. Around him, in disciplined formation, flew the other fighters of Jagdgeschwader 26, experienced men, veterans of Poland, France, the Battle of Britain, men who had painted dozens of victory marks on their fuselages, men who still believed in German technical superiority, in the precision of their machines, in the deadly elegance of their aerial duels. It was then that Oberleutnant Hans Priller's voice burst over the radio, breaking the silence like a stone thrown through thin ice. "Achtung! Contacts at 3 o'clock. High, very high." Keller turned his head sharply and saw they were large, absurdly large. They looked like flying cylinders, metal creatures that shouldn't be at that altitude. Not with that wingspan, not with that obese and awkward fuselage. They flew in open formation, as if they had all the time in the world, as if the sky belonged to them by right. P-47 Thunderbolts. The Americans. Keller frowned. He had heard about them. Vague reports, conflicting information. A single-engine fighter equipped with a radial engine, transport stuff, not combat. Heavy as a light bomber, they said. Slow to turn. Without elegance. Priller's voice echoed again, now laden with disdain and a broken laugh. "Mein Gott, look at that. They look like pregnant cows trying to fly. Who designed these things? An American farmer?" Laughter exploded over the radio. Keller couldn't contain a half smile. It was true. Compared to the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, pure lines, sharp aerodynamics, lethal elegance, those American monsters looked like mechanical jokes. Flying barrels, soulless industrial hardware. "Let's see if they know how to fight," said Priller, with the arrogance of someone who had already shot down 37 enemies. The German formation began to climb. The engines groaned, the wings trembled, but the 109s were agile, responsive, made for this, for the duel, for man-to-man confrontation, eye to eye. But something strange happened. The Thunderbolts didn't turn to engage, didn't dive, didn't flee. They kept flying, straight, impassive, as if the Germans were irrelevant. And then, for the first time, Keller heard the sound. It was still distant. A deep, profound thunder, coming from very high. It wasn't the sharp scream of English Merlin engines. It wasn't the furious roar of German Daimler-Benz engines. It was something else, something industrial, something that didn't belong to the sky but to the earth, to steel, to factories, to assembly lines. The sound of something that didn't need to be elegant, just inevitable. Keller felt a strange pang in his chest. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was something smaller, more subtle, curiosity, unease, the feeling that something had changed in the balance of things, and he didn't yet understand what. Priller laughed again on the radio. "Let them go, they're not worth our fuel." The German formation turned back. The Thunderbolts disappeared into the western clouds, carrying with them that deep sound, that distant thunder that still echoed in Keller's mind when he landed, hours later, at the base. That night he couldn't sleep properly, because the sound was still there, and he didn't know why. 3 weeks later, the sky was no longer crystal. It was beaten iron, cloudy, heavy with humidity and tension. May had brought irregular rains over France, and with them, more American incursions. Keller was flying an intercept patrol when the alarm came over the radio. B-17 bombers escorted over Amiens. Altitude, 25,000 feet. Escort, the Thunderbolts. This time, there would be no laughter. The German formation climbed through the clouds like blades through fabric. 12 Messerschmitts, 6 Focke-Wulf 190s. All veterans, all hungry. The bombers were the target, they always were, But the Americans were there, orbiting the flying fortresses like obese and gleaming guard dogs. Priller took command, his voice harsh and metallic on the radio. "Ignore the fighters. Straight for the bombers. Head-on attack, maximum speed. Schnell!" Keller pushed the stick forward. The Messerschmitt dove like an eagle, the engine roaring, the structure vibrating. The world became pure speed, wind, adrenaline. Below, the silver silhouettes of the B-17s grew rapidly, their turrets rotating, searching for targets. That's when the thunder returned. But now it wasn't distant. It was on top of them. Keller raised his eyes by instinct and saw the shadow. A P-47 was plummeting from above like an anvil thrown from the heavens. It didn't turn, didn't maneuver, just fell, in a vertical dive accelerating beyond anything Keller had ever seen. The sound of the Pratt & Whitney engine was deafening, an industrial, mechanical, inhuman roar. And then, the machine guns, 8 M2 Browning, 50 caliber, opened fire at the same time. The sky tore apart. They weren't short. Elegant bursts from 20mm cannons. It was a rain of metal, a continuous, brutal torrent that cut through the air like a scythe through wheat. The sound was unmistakable, thunder breaking reality into pieces. The Focke-Wulf ahead of Keller exploded, simply exploded. There were no dramatic flames, no slow and heroic fall. The left wing shattered, the cockpit was pierced, and the fuselage broke in half. The pilot, Keller didn't even know his name, disappeared inside a cloud of debris and oil. Keller pulled the stick violently, veering right. His heart pounded. Cold sweat ran down his forehead. The P-47 passed like a steel comet, pulling away at impossible speed, climbing again, disappearing into the clouds before anyone could react. "Was zur Hölle?" Someone's voice trembled on the radio. The German formation scattered. There was no more coordination, only survival. Keller saw another Thunderbolt dive, and another, and another. They didn't fight like the Spitfires, spinning, dancing, fencing, duel. They crushed. They dove from above, fired, climbed again before any reaction was possible. Boom and zoom, brute power. Industrial physics applied to aerial combat. Keller managed to fire a burst at a passing P-47. He saw the tracers hit the fuselage. He saw sparks. He saw nothing. The American plane kept flying as if nothing had happened, as if his bullets were mosquito bites. Minutes later, or maybe hours, Keller no longer knew, the combat ended. 2 bombers shot down. 1 damaged, but 4 Germans didn't return, and 1 P-47 fell, only 1. That night, in the base canteen, no one was laughing. Priller sat alone, staring at his glass of schnapps, as if a death sentence were written there. Keller heard the rumors, stories from other squadrons. An American pilot, Johnson, they said, had survived an impossible attack. 200 hits, shredded fuselage, engine on fire, and still he flew back home. Keller closed his eyes. The sound of thunder still echoed in his mind, and for the first time he understood. It wasn't an airplane, it was a message. June 26, 1943. The date would be carved into Luftwaffe memory like a scar that never heals. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber, young, 23, 7 kills to his name, was flying high cover over the Pas-de-Calais when he spotted the lone Thunderbolt. It was separated from its formation, trailing slightly, perhaps 2,000 feet below the main group. Thy straggler, easy prey. Weber's heart quickened. A P-47, alone, vulnerable. He signaled to his wingman, rolled inverted, and dove. The Focke-Wulf 190 was a beautiful killer, fast, powerful, armed with 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns. Weber had seen Spitfires disintegrate under that firepower. He had watched American bombers spiral into the earth, wings torn away like paper. This would be his 8th kill. He closed to 200 meters. The Thunderbolt pilot seemed unaware, flying straight and level, almost lazily. Weber's finger tightened on the trigger. The gun sight centered on the broad fuselage, that fat, ungainly body that the Germans had learned to mock. He fired. The cannons roared. Shells tore through the air, bright streaks of destruction. Weber saw them impact, metal sparking, pieces flying, smoke beginning to trail from the cowling. He fired again and again. The Thunderbolt shuddered under the impacts but kept flying. Weber frowned. He pulled up slightly, repositioned, dove again. This time he held the trigger down longer, expending ammunition in a sustained burst that should have cut the American plane in half. More impacts, more smoke. The Thunderbolt's canopy shattered. The rudder was torn, flapping uselessly. Oil streamed from the engine, coating the fuselage in black streaks, but it didn't fall. It didn't even turn. Weber felt something cold creep into his stomach. This wasn't right. Nothing could absorb that much damage. Nothing should absorb that much damage. He came around for another pass. His wingman joined him. Together, they poured fire into the wounded American. The Thunderbolt was a flying wreck now, holes everywhere, control surfaces damaged, one landing gear hanging loose, trailing hydraulic fluid. Inside that cockpit, Weber knew, was a man who should be dead, a man who should have bailed out 3 attacks ago. But the Thunderbolt flew on. The engine, that massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial, continued to turn. 18 cylinders of American industrial power, refusing to die. The propeller kept spinning, pulling the aircraft forward through sheer mechanical stubbornness. Weber made a 4th pass. His cannons clicked empty. He had expended all his ammunition. His wingman was out as well. The 2 Focke-Wulfs pulled alongside the dying Thunderbolt, flying formation with it for a moment. Weber could see into the shattered cockpit now, could see the pilot slumped forward, blood on the instruments, the stick held in place by a hand that refused to let go. The American turned his head slowly. For one impossible moment, their eyes met across the void. Weber saw no fear there, only determination, only the absolute refusal to surrender. The Thunderbolt pilot, Robert S. Johnson, though Weber would not learn the name until years later, raised one bloodied hand and saluted. Weber felt his breath catch. In all his time in combat, through all the kills and victories and celebrations, he had never felt what he felt in that moment. Not triumph, respect, and something deeper, darker. The recognition that he had just witnessed something that should not exist, a machine that could not be killed, a pilot who would not die, a manifestation of something new in warfare, not skill, not courage, not even luck, pure, unstoppable industrial might. Weber returned the salute. Then he waggled his wings and peeled away, his wingman following. They watched as the battered Thunderbolt continued westward, trailing smoke and oil, pieces falling from its frame, but flying, always flying. Robert S. Johnson would make it back to England. He would land his Thunderbolt, a plane with 21 cannon shell impacts and over 200 machine gun hits, on a British airfield. The ground crew would count the holes in silence, unable to comprehend how the aircraft had remained airborne. Johnson would fly again, would score 27 victories, would survive the war. But for Weber, returning to base that afternoon, the war had already changed. He tried to explain what he had seen to his squadron mates, tried to describe the impossible resilience, the mechanical invincibility. They didn't believe him, not fully, not until it happened to them, not until they all heard the thunder and understood what it meant. That night, Weber lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling. Outside, he could hear the distant rumble of aircraft engines, German bombers heading out for night raids. But in his mind, he heard only one sound. The deep, relentless roar of that Pratt & Whitney engine, still running, still pulling that broken aircraft home. The sound of a machine that refused to acknowledge defeat. The sound of the future. The sound of the thunder that would not stop until everything before it was swept away. Weber closed his eyes, and for the first time since joining the Luftwaffe, he felt afraid. The briefing room at Jagdgeschwader 26 headquarters smelled of stale cigarette smoke and anxiety. Evening light filtered through narrow windows, casting long shadows across maps pinned to the walls. Keller sat in the back row, watching Major Klaus Mitusch review intelligence reports. The major was a skilled pilot. 43 kills, Iron Cross with oak leaves, but tonight his hands trembled as he turned the pages. "Gentlemen," Mitusch began, his voice strained, "we need to discuss the American P-47. A murmur rippled through the room. Priller, seated near the front, lit another cigarette and said nothing. In the past 6 weeks, we have recorded 17 encounters with this aircraft. Our kill ratio is problematic. Someone laughed bitterly, because the damned things won't die. They absorb damage like no fighter we've encountered, Miatush said flatly. 20mm cannon fire, direct hits. They continue flying. He pulled out a photograph showing a P-47 on an English airfield. The fuselage was riddled with holes. The tail section looked like Swiss cheese, and yet there it sat, intact enough to have landed. Keller stared at the image. He had seen it himself, had put rounds into those aircraft, and watched them simply continue. "What do we know about their design?" someone asked. Miatush extracted a captured document and read aloud. "The chief designer is Alexander Kartveli, Georgian, working for Republic Aviation. When asked why he made the P-47 so large, he reportedly said, 'I do not design fighters to dogfight. I design them to bring my pilots home alive.'" Silence fell over the room. Keller felt the words settle into his chest. The Germans had built instruments of precision, scalpels for the sky. The Americans had built a hammer. No elegance, no grace, just raw functionality wrapped in armor and driven by the most powerful engine ever mounted on a single-seat fighter. "Their tactics are simple," Miatush continued. "They dive from altitude, attack with overwhelming firepower, then climb away before we can respond. Boom and zoom. They do not engage in turning fights." "Because they cannot turn with us," Priller interjected, though his voice lacked conviction. "Because they do not need to," Miatush corrected. "They have changed the rules entirely." Outside, thunder rumbled, a summer storm approaching. But the men in that room heard something else, an echo, a premonition. As Keller filed out, he overheard 2 pilots whispering, "Have you heard what they're calling it? Jabo Verga, the fighter bomber strangler." "I heard different. The propaganda office won't print it, but frontline units have another name." "What?" A pause. Then, barely audible, "Roosevelt's Thunder." Keller walked back to his quarters through the gathering storm. Rain began to fall, heavy drops drumming against concrete, but in his mind he heard only that other sound, that mechanical roar, that industrial symphony of 18 cylinders and 8 machine guns, the sound that was coming for them all. He looked up at the darkening sky and wondered how much time they had left. That night, lying in his bunk, Keller heard the distant rumble of aircraft engines, German bombers heading out. But mixed with it, or perhaps only in his imagination, was that deeper sound, that relentless thunder, growing louder, coming closer, inevitable. Normandy. June 6th, 1944. D-Day +7. Keller no longer flew. A shattered collarbone from a bailout 3 months prior had grounded him indefinitely. Now he served as a tactical observer, coordinating what remained of the Luftwaffe's crumbling defensive operations from a forward command post near Caen. From the ground, the war looked different, looked like what it truly was, annihilation. The morning air trembled with a sound that had become constant, inescapable, not the crack of artillery, not the rumble of tanks grinding through bocage hedgerows. Something else, something that came from above and never, ever stopped. The thunder. Keller stood outside the bunker, binoculars raised, watching the sky. It was filled with them. Dozens. Hundreds. P-47 Thunderbolts in wave after wave, flying low over the Norman countryside, hunting, always hunting. They no longer fought just in the air. They had become something worse. Ground attack aircraft, Jabo, Jagd bomber. Each one carried bombs, rockets, and those 8 machine guns that could shred a panzer column in seconds. A convoy of German trucks moved along the road 3 kilometers west. Keller saw them. The P-47s saw them too. 4 Thunderbolts peeled off from formation, diving like birds of prey. The sound built in that distinctive roar of the R-2800 engines at full throttle, a mechanical scream that announced death before it arrived. Rockets streaked downward. Orange flashes erupted along the road. Trucks exploded, flipped, burned. The Thunderbolts pulled up, circled lazily, came around again. Machine guns hammered the survivors. Then they climbed back to altitude, rejoined their formation and flew on to find more targets. The entire attack lasted 90 seconds. Keller lowered his binoculars. His hands were steady now. Fear had become so constant that it no longer registered as an emotion. It was simply the air he breathed. A young corporal approached, carrying a dispatch. Herr Hauptmann, orders from division. All mobile units are to move only at night. Daytime movement is inadvisable. Inadvisable. A polite word for suicide. Keller nodded. Acknowledged. The corporal hesitated. Sir, is it true what they say, that we shot down only 12 yesterday, and they flew over 800 sorties? 800. Keller had seen the reports. The numbers were incomprehensible. The Americans had so many aircraft that losses meant nothing. For every P-47 that fell, 3 more appeared. The factories across the Atlantic were pumping them out faster than the Luftwaffe could count them, let alone shoot them down. It's true, Keller said quietly. The corporal looked at the sky, where contrails crisscrossed like scars. Then we've already lost, haven't we? Keller didn't answer. He didn't need to. The sky roared above them, a continuous thunder that drowned out hope, drowned out defiance, drowned out everything except the brutal mathematics of industrial warfare. The thunder that never stopped. The thunder that owned the sky, the earth, and everything between. Keller turned and walked back into the bunker. Outside, the sound continued. Always. March 1945. The fatherland was dying. Keller flew again. There was no choice. Every pilot who could still hold a stick was thrown into the air. Injuries be damned. His collarbone had healed poorly, pain shooting through his shoulder with every movement, but pain was irrelevant now. The mission was simple and suicidal: intercept American bombers over Dresden. Keller's staffel numbered 8 aircraft. 8 Bf-109s, cobbled together from spare parts, fueled with synthetic gasoline that fouled the engines, flown by pilots ranging from grizzled veterans to 17-year-old boys with barely 40 hours of flight time. They climbed through grey morning sky. Below, Germany was a landscape of ruins, cities reduced to rubble, roads cratered, bridges collapsed. The 1,000-year Reich dying in its 12th year. The bombers appeared at 24,000 feet, B-17s, perhaps 60 of them, flying in tight defensive boxes, and surrounding them, above them, orbiting like mechanical angels of death, the Thunderbolts. Keller counted at least 40, maybe more. It didn't matter. All aircraft, he said into the radio, his voice flat. Attack formation. God be with us. No one answered. There was nothing to say. They dove. The P-47s fell on them like hammers on anvils. The first 109 disintegrated before Keller even saw what hit it. Just there one moment, gone the next, replaced by debris and a parachute that would never open. The second and third collided, trying to evade, wings locking together as they spiraled earthward. Keller fired at a bomber, saw his rounds spark off armor, then jerked the stick as tracers ripped past his canopy. A Thunderbolt flashed by, so close he could see the invasion stripes, the kill marks, the pilot's face behind armored glass. He tried to turn to fight, but his 109 was sluggish, starved of proper fuel, the engine coughing. The Thunderbolt came around effortlessly, not fast, not elegant, just inevitable. 8 guns opened fire. Keller's instrument panel exploded, his left wing shredded. Smoke filled the cockpit. He pulled the canopy release, felt wind tear at him, reached for the ejection lever. The aircraft snapped inverted. Ground and sky traded places. He pulled the lever. The world became wind and chaos. Then the parachute deployed, jerking him violently as the Messerschmitt tumbled away, trailing black smoke. Keller hung in the straps, rotating slowly, watching. Above, the battle continued for perhaps 90 seconds more. Then it was over. The bombers flew on, untouched. The Thunderbolts reformed, circled once like victors surveying conquest, then followed their charges westward. Keller counted parachutes. 3. 3 survivors out of 8. He looked at the sky, that vast, empty, pitiless sky that had once belonged to the Luftwaffe, once been their kingdom. It belonged to someone else now, to the thunder, to the machine, to the future that had no place for men like him. Keller drifted downward through cold March air, For the first time in 4 years of war, he felt relief. It was over. He had survived, and he would never have to hear that sound again, or so he thought. He landed in a field of frozen mud, rolled his shoulder painfully, and began walking toward the distant tree line. Behind him, columns of smoke rose from crashed aircraft. Above, the contrails faded slowly, like scars healing on the face of the sky. The thunder had passed, but its echo remained always. 40 years after the thunder stopped, a hotel conference room in Duxford, England. The Imperial War Museum had organized a reunion of pilots, American, British, German, old enemies, now old men, gathering to remember a war that had consumed their youth and defined their lives. Ernst Keller sat at a table near the window, a cup of tea cooling in his hands. He was 72 now, his hair white, his face deeply lined. The shoulder still ached in cold weather. Some wounds never truly heal. Across the room, he recognized faces. Robert S. Johnson, the man who wouldn't die, laughing with a group of American veterans. British Spitfire pilots comparing stories. And there, holding court near the bar, Adolf Galland, once the youngest general in the Luftwaffe, now just another old man in a civilian suit. A documentary crew was filming. A young interviewer approached Keller's table, microphone in hand, cameraman trailing behind. Herr Keller, would you mind answering a few questions? Keller gestured to an empty chair. Of course. The interviewer sat, adjusted his notes. You flew against the P-47 Thunderbolt throughout the war. What are your thoughts on that aircraft? Looking back? Keller was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the English countryside rolled away in green tranquility. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of a vintage aircraft engine, probably one of the museum's restored warbirds preparing for an airshow demonstration. We were arrogant, Keller said finally. We believed that elegance mattered, that precision and engineering superiority would win. We laughed at the Thunderbolt, called it fat, clumsy, a flying milk jug. He paused, sipped his tea. We were fools. The interviewer leaned forward. But why do you say that? Because we did not understand what it represented. It was not a fighter in the way we understood fighters. It was a manifestation of American industrial power, a machine built not to dance in the sky, but to win through sheer, overwhelming force. Galland had approached during the conversation. He stood beside the table now, listening. May I? He asked, gesturing to another chair. Keller nodded. Galland sat there, looking at the camera with the ease of a man who had given many interviews. There was a sound, Galland said, his English accented but clear. We called it Roosevelt's piano, that deep roar of the radial engine combined with the hammering of 850 caliber machine guns. When you heard it above you, you knew. Knew what? The interviewer asked. Galland's face was solemn. That the end had come. Keller closed his eyes. And there it was, as vivid as 40 years ago. That sound, that thunder, the mechanical roar that had haunted his dreams, that had announced the future, that had swept away everything he had known. The sound never leaves you, Keller said quietly. I still hear it sometimes, in storms, in distant aircraft, in my dreams. He opened his eyes, looked directly at the camera. It was the sound of the 20th century, the sound of the machine age, the sound of everything changing, whether we wanted it to or not. Outside, the vintage aircraft passed overhead. For just a moment, Keller tensed, then relaxed. Different engine, different sound, different time. But the thunder remained, always, in memory, in history, in the echo that never truly fades, the sound of the Thunderbolt, the sound of the future that became the past, the sound of the war that changed everything. When we heard that sound, the deep thunder of those American radial engines, we knew the end had arrived. We called it Roosevelt's piano, and when it played, there was no encore. General Adolf Galland, Luftwaffe, post-war interview.